The storm had been clawing at the mountain all day, a white curtain of snow and wind that made even the wolves retreat to their dens. James Foster, the mountain man who had carved his lonely homestead out of pine and stone, was splitting the last of his wood when he heard it. Thin voices carried on the wind, so faint he thought at first it was the groaning of the pines. But then it came again, clearer, high-pitched and desperate, words broken by sobs. "Please don't beat us, our mama's dying." He turned sharply, axe still in hand, his breath clouding the air. The cry came from near the tree line, just where the forest gave way to the frozen clearing around his cabin. And there they were, two small figures stumbling through knee-deep snow, their clothes ragged, their tiny hands raw and red from the cold. They were girls, Chinese by their features, no older than 8 or 9, their black hair tangled, their eyes wide with terror and exhaustion. They half collapsed at the edge of his yard, clutching each other as if the snow itself would swallow them whole. James dropped the axe and went to them, kneeling down in the snow so his towering shape wouldn't frighten them more. Up close, their faces were streaked with tears and dirt, their lips blue from cold. One of them spoke again, voice shaking so badly he had to lean in to hear. "Don't hit us, please. We only want help. Mama, she's dying." The other clung tighter to her sister's sleeve, nodding with frantic eyes. It hit him like a hammer to the chest. These weren't just runaways, these were children on the edge of death, out here in a storm that could kill a grown man in hours. He scooped them both up without another word, ignoring their flinch at his touch, and carried them into his cabin. The warmth of the fire washed over them, and for a moment the girls just sat there, shivering, staring at the flames like they couldn't believe it was real. James gave them each a tin cup of warm water, then crouched low in front of them, his voice rough but steady. "Tell me where your mama is." They looked at each other, then back at him, as though unsure if they could trust him. Finally, the older one, her voice barely more than a whisper, said, "In the woods. Not far. She fell, she can't move." The younger added, "She said to find help. She said if we don't, she'll die." Their little voices broke on the last word, tears streaming fresh down their faces. James didn't hesitate. He pulled on his heavy coat, slung his rifle across his back, and grabbed the lantern. "Stay here by the fire. Don't move. No one's going to hurt you." His voice carried the weight of command, but also something else, gentleness, the kind he hadn't used in years. The girls nodded, too exhausted to argue, their tiny hands wrapped around the cups as though they were holding life itself. The storm hit him hard the moment he stepped back outside, snow slicing into his beard and eyes. But the girls' footprints were still visible, leading into the trees, and he followed them fast, lantern swaying in his grip. The trail was desperate, zigzagging, with signs of where the children had stumbled and dragged themselves back up. And then, at the base of a fir tree half buried in snow, he found her. A woman, her skin as pale as the snow around her, her body shaking with fever. She was clearly Chinese, her hair long and matted, her breath shallow. Her eyes fluttered open at the sound of him, and for a moment fear flickered there, fear that he was another man come to harm her. But then she seemed to recognize something in his face, something human, and her hand weakly lifted toward him. "My girls," she whispered in a voice so thin it nearly vanished in the wind. "They're safe," James said, kneeling down and brushing snow from her face. "They're by the fire. You're coming too." He scooped her up, light as nothing, bones and rags, and began the long trudge back through the storm. The woman coughed weakly, her head falling against his chest, and he tightened his grip. He wasn't going to let her die out here, not while her children waited, not while she still had breath in her body. By the time he reached the cabin, his shoulders ached and his lungs burned, but the sight of the two girls rushing to the door with wide, tearful eyes gave him strength. He laid their mother down on his bed, wrapping her in furs, stoking the fire higher, boiling water for broth. The girls clung to their mother's hands, whispering in Chinese through their tears. James stood over them, a rough, solitary man who had sworn never to care for anyone again. And yet here he was, fighting a storm and death itself to keep 3 strangers alive. And in that moment, though he couldn't yet know it, his lonely life on the mountain had changed forever. The cabin had never felt so small, so alive. The fire roared in the hearth, its orange light dancing across the log walls, casting shadows that leapt like restless spirits. James moved with a quiet urgency, heating water, grinding herbs he kept for wounds and fever, stripping strips of linen from an old shirt to use as cloths. The mother lay still, her face ghostly pale against the dark furs, her chest rising in shallow, uneven breaths. The two girls clung to her hands, whispering words he could not understand, but their tone carried the weight of prayer, of desperate hope. James crouched beside her, dipping a cloth into warm water and laying it gently across her brow. She stirred faintly, eyelids fluttering, but her strength was nearly gone. He could see it in the way her fingers trembled when she tried to squeeze her daughter's hands, as though even love itself was slipping from her grasp. "Drink," James said softly, holding a wooden cup to her lips. He tilted it carefully, coaxing her to swallow the broth he'd prepared. She choked once, weakly, then managed a few sips. It wasn't much, but it was something. He set the cup aside, looking into her dark, fever-glazed eyes. "You'll make it through tonight," he told her, more for the girl's sake than her own. His voice was steady, certain, though doubt gnawed at his chest. The older girl looked up at him then, her eyes shining with both fear and gratitude. "You, help Mama." Her English was broken, hesitant, but her hope was sharp as glass. James nodded once, slow and firm. "I'll do what I can." Through the long night, he tended her, feeding the fire, wiping sweat from her brow, coaxing her to sip broth or water when she could. The girls refused to leave their mother's side, their small bodies curled against her under the heavy furs. James didn't try to move them. He knew that warmth, that closeness, was as much medicine as anything he could give. But as the hours dragged on, he noticed the other details, the bruises fading yellow along her wrists, the raw welts at the base of her neck, the way the girls flinched whenever his boots scraped the floor too quickly. Whoever had left them in this state had not only abandoned them but hurt them, beaten them until running into the teeth of a storm seemed safer. Rage burned low in his gut, a steady fire hotter than the one in his hearth. At one point near midnight, the mother stirred more fully. Her cracked lips moved, forming words in a tongue James couldn't follow. But then, broken English pushed through the fever. "No, beat, girls. Please." Her eyes locked onto his, pleading, even as her strength faded. James leaned closer, his rough hand covering hers. "No one's going to hurt them here. Not ever again." A faint sigh escaped her, a breath of relief, as though she had been holding those words like a stone on her chest. Her eyelids fluttered shut again, and she drifted back into uneasy sleep. The storm outside howled and battered the walls, but inside the cabin was a world apart, a place where life still clung to fragile roots, where love fought against death, and where one man who thought he had nothing left to give found himself guarding three strangers as though they were blood of his own blood. By dawn, James's eyes burned with exhaustion, but he never left the bedside. The girls, worn out from weeping, slept curled against their mother, their small faces streaked with dried tears. The woman still breathed, shallow, weak, but alive, and as the first gray light of morning crept through the cracks in the shutters, James knew this was only the beginning. Because if someone had hurt them badly enough to drive them into the mountains, then someone might come looking. And if they did, he was ready. The mountain gave birth to a brittle dawn, gray light spilling through tattered clouds, laying its cold hand across the valley. James rose from his chair with aching limbs, every muscle stiff from the long night's vigil. He stirred the fire back to life, then turned to the bed. The woman still lived, her chest moved in shallow rhythm, but her skin remained hot with fever. The two girls slept curled against her side, their thin hands gripping her blanket as if they feared she might vanish in the night. For a time, the world felt almost still, broken only by the crackle of the hearth. But James had lived too many years alone in these mountains not to hear it when the silence changed. Somewhere far down the valley came the faint creak of saddle leather, the crunch of hooves in crusted snow, the murmur of men's voices carried on the wind. He froze where he stood, his hand tightening around the rifle leaning against the wall. He stepped onto the porch, careful to keep his shadow hidden in the doorway. Squinting into the pale light, he saw them at last, 3 riders at the tree line, dark against the snow, their horses steaming. They weren't locals. Their hats were broad, their coats long, rifles across their saddles. They didn't ride like mountain men, cautious and loose-hipped. They rode with purpose, hard and upright, like men hunting something. Or someone. James's jaw set, he slipped back inside, shutting the door softly behind him. The girls stirred, blinking sleep from their eyes, and their fear rose instantly when they saw his face. The younger one whispered, "Bad men." He didn't answer with words. He knelt to her level, placed a finger gently against her lips, and nodded once. That was all she needed. The child shrank back to her mother's side, trembling. The riders drew closer as the morning stretched. By mid-sun, there were 6 of them, circling slow through the trees, their eyes sharp, scanning. James could hear fragments when the wind carried, harsh words, English mixed with something else, and once or twice, curses in Chinese. His stomach turned. Whoever these men were, they had a claim over the woman and her girls, and it wasn't one born of kindness. That evening, as shadows stretched long, the knock came, heavy, the kind that was less request than command. James rose, his rifle already in his hands, and opened the door just enough to meet the man on the other side. The leader stood there, tall, thin, with a black mustache and eyes hard as flint. 2 others flanked him, rifles casually pointed low but ready. "You seen 3 runaways?" the leader asked, his voice oily, almost mocking. "Chinese woman, 2 brats. Belong to our camp down in the valley. They work for us. Stole off in the night. Can't have that." His eyes flicked past James's shoulder, trying to see into the cabin. James didn't move, didn't blink. "Ain't seen anyone," he said flatly. His voice carried no hesitation, though his heart hammered in his chest. The leader smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "That's so. Funny thing. Tracks come right this way. Snow don't lie, old man." He leaned forward, boots crunching on the porch. "Now, I ain't asking again. You best not be hiding what's mine." Behind James, the girls whimpered, too soft for most ears, but not for the men outside. The leader's smile widened like a knife slit. "Well, now, that answers that." James stepped fully into the doorway, blocking the cabin with his broad frame, rifle raised now, muzzle steady on the leader's chest. His voice came low and certain, the kind of tone a man only used when death was near. "Ain't nothing in this cabin belongs to you." The air froze, tighter than the winter wind. The men's hands twitched toward their rifles, but James's finger was already curled on the trigger. For a long moment, no one moved. The leader's smirk faltered, and he spat into the snow. "This ain't done," he said coldly. "We'll be back. You can't keep what don't belong to you." They mounted and rode off into the dusk, their figures swallowed by the tree line, but James knew they weren't gone for good. Men like that never gave up so easily. He barred the door, set his rifle close, and looked at the trembling family huddled on his bed. The woman's fever had broken into a sweat, her strength still fragile, her daughters clutching her hands. James sat back in his chair, the firelight flickering across his weathered face. His solitude was gone, his quiet mountain life shattered, but in its place stood something fiercer than loneliness, responsibility, and a resolve as hard as the rock beneath his cabin. Those men would come back, and when they did, he'd be ready. And for the first time in many years, James Foster found that he didn't mind the thought of fighting for someone else's life more than his own. Night fell heavy, the kind of blackness that swallowed sound as well as sight. The storm had passed, leaving a silence that felt more dangerous than any thunder. James sat near the fire, rifle across his knees, listening. The girls dozed in the loft above, curled together under a heap of blankets, their mother resting weakly at their side. Every crack of the logs in the hearth made him tense. He knew the men hadn't gone far. Wolves didn't wander from the scent of prey so quickly. Sometime after midnight, the first sound came, the sharp cry of a crow, unnatural at that hour. A signal. James's body stiffened. Then, in the darkness beyond the cabin walls, he caught it, the crunch of boots in snow, hushed voices, and the faint metallic click of a rifle bolt drawn back. They'd returned, and this time, they weren't knocking. James rose silently, doused the lantern, and let the fire burn low until the room sank into dim shadows. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. Shapes moved in the tree line, dark figures spreading wide, encircling his cabin. 6, maybe more. The leader's voice hissed low, "Take him alive if you can. Kill him if you must. The woman and brats come back either way." Rage coiled in James's chest, cold and steady. They weren't here to bargain, they were here to take. His hand tightened on the rifle. He remembered the bruises on the woman's arms, the terror in her daughter's eyes. He thought of her whisper, "No beat, girls. Please." A man couldn't run from that. The first intruder tried the back door, easing it open with slow, careful hands. James didn't wait. The rifle cracked like thunder, the shot tearing through the stillness. A scream split the night, and the man fell hard into the snow. Chaos followed, shouts, curses, men scattering for cover. Bullets slammed into the cabin walls, wood splintering, but the logs held. Smoke from gunpowder mingled with the smell of pine, and James's eyes burned with focus. He moved like a man who'd fought before, every motion efficient. Fire, reload, fire again. He kept low, shifting positions so they couldn't pin him down. 2 more fell trying to rush the front. Still, there were too many. The cabin shuddered as one of them hurled a torch onto the roof, flames licking fast along the dry shingles. The girls screamed from the loft, the sound piercing James's chest. He snatched a pail of water, dousing the fire before it could spread, then returned to the door just in time to see the leader advancing through the smoke. The man's revolver gleamed in the firelight, his eyes burning with hatred. "You're dead, old man," he snarled, raising his gun. James didn't think. He lunged forward, slamming the door wide open, his shoulder driving the leader backward off the porch. They hit the snow hard, rolling, fists and elbows striking. The revolver clattered away, lost in the drifts. James drove his fist into the man's jaw, then his gut, each blow fueled by a lifetime of anger and solitude sharpened into purpose. The leader spat blood, eyes blazing. "They're mine, you can't keep them," he shouted, clawing for a knife at his belt. But before he could draw it, James swung the butt of his rifle down hard, ending the fight in one brutal crack. The man lay still, groaning faintly, his strength broken. The remaining attackers faltered, seeing their leader down. They lingered at the tree line, guns half raised, but none dared advance. One shouted something sharp in Chinese, and slowly, grudgingly, they dragged their wounded and fallen away into the dark. Their threat wasn't gone, not forever, but for tonight, they were beaten. Breath ragged, James stood in the snow, rifle still in hand, eyes scanning the shadows until the last hoofbeat faded. Only then did he return to the cabin, bolting the door behind him. The girls scrambled down from the loft, clutching him, tears streaking their faces. Their mother, pale but conscious, whispered weakly from her bed. James couldn't understand all the words, but he understood enough: gratitude, relief, trust. For the first time in years, his cabin was no longer a fortress of solitude but a sanctuary of the living. And though danger still lingered beyond the tree line, James knew one thing with unshakable certainty: these 3 souls were his to protect now, no matter the cost. The cabin was still smoldering from the night's violence when the gray dawn crept over the ridges. James stepped outside, the snow stained with blood, the ground torn with footprints and horse tracks leading back into the timber. He knew they'd return, not just 6 next time, but maybe 20. Men like that didn't forgive humiliation. They'd go fetch others, armed and hungry for revenge. He leaned on his rifle, looking toward the horizon. The mountains stretched wide and endless, a labyrinth of stone and pine that only a seasoned woodsman could vanish into. He'd lived in their embrace for years, learning every stream, every hidden pass. If they stayed, they'd survive. If they lingered here, they'd die. Inside, the woman had gained a measure of strength. She sat propped on the bed, her eyes fever bright but steady, her daughters clinging to her sides. They watched him when he entered, waiting. The younger girl whispered, "Bad men come back." James nodded slowly. "Aye, and worse." The woman's lips parted, and though her English was broken, the plea was clear: "You, help us." Her gaze was fierce despite her weakness, a mother's desperation wrapped in frail flesh. James knelt, setting his calloused hand gently over hers. "I'll get you safe," he said simply. By noon, he had the cabin stripped to essentials: dried meat, blankets, medicine, tools. He lashed supplies to his pack mule, tightened the girls' coats, and lifted their mother onto a makeshift sled drawn by rope. The wind howled as they set out, snow crunching underfoot, but James moved with quiet determination. Each step was a promise. The journey was brutal. The mountains offered no mercy: steep climbs, biting cold, rivers half frozen and treacherous. The girls stumbled often, their small legs weary, but James carried them when he had to, never slowing, never faltering. At night, he built fires in hidden hollows, cooking what little they had, keeping his rifle across his knees as the girls slept curled against their mother. Days blurred together, each dawn colder than the last. Yet with every mile, the family's fear eased, replaced by a fragile hope. The woman's fever broke fully by the 4th day, her strength returning in whispers, enough to stand and walk short distances. She would look at James when she thought he wasn't watching, her eyes soft with something more than gratitude, a trust few men had ever earned. At last, they reached a high valley, a place James had found years before and never shared with another soul. A hidden meadow surrounded by towering granite walls, with a clear stream cutting through, sheltered from wind. Few men would ever stumble upon it, and none would track them here. This was sanctuary. He built them a new shelter there, smaller than his cabin but warm and solid, smoke curling gently from its chimney by the week's end. The girls laughed again, chasing each other along the creek, their voices carrying like birdsong. Their mother watched them with tears glistening in her eyes, whispering prayers James couldn't understand but didn't need to. And when she finally turned to him, laying her frail hand against his rough cheek, James felt something stir deep within him, a warmth he thought long dead. For years, he had lived in silence, burdened only by the weight of his own solitude. But now, in this hidden valley, he realized he was no longer alone. The world beyond the mountains might still come for them. The men might search, rage, threaten. But here, under the shadow of the peaks, James had chosen his path. He would fight for them, guide them, shelter them, for as long as his strength endured. For the first time in many years, the mountain man no longer lived for himself. He lived for the family fate had placed in his care, and in their eyes, he saw not just fear and need, but a new beginning. And in that cold, unforgiving wilderness, it was enough. Winter held the mountains in its frozen fist for many long weeks. Snow piled high against the walls of the new cabin, and the pines groaned beneath their heavy coats of white. For James, the days were long with labor, cutting wood, trapping small game, teaching the girls to set snares and boil hides. Yet for the first time in years, the work felt lighter. Each swing of his axe was for someone other than himself, each fire he lit warmed more than just his own bones. The girls grew bolder. The younger one, May, followed James like a shadow, eager to learn his ways. She asked questions in broken English, pointing at tracks in the snow, repeating words until they stuck. The older one, Lien, stayed closer to her mother, though she often watched James with curious eyes, as though measuring him against the memory of the men who had hurt them. Slowly, she began to smile again. Slowly, she began to trust. The woman, her name, James finally learned, was Lee, regained her strength day by day. She still moved with care, her body marked by scars that spoke of years of hardship, but her spirit grew brighter in the safety of the valley. She cooked meals from what James hunted, softening the meat with herbs she found buried beneath the snow, teaching her daughters to sing old songs as they worked. The cabin, once a hollow refuge, filled with voices, with warmth. One night, after the girls had gone to sleep, James sat outside by the dying fire, the sky wide and thick with stars. And Lee stepped out quietly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, her breath rising in the icy air. She stood beside him in silence for a long while, watching the heavens. Then she whispered, her voice soft but steady, "Why you help us? Risk your life." James stared into the fire, the question burning as deep as the coals. He thought of the loneliness that had carved into him, the nights he had stared at the mountains and wondered if he was already a ghost. He thought of the bruises on her arms, the terror in her daughter's eyes. And then he spoke the only truth he knew. "Because no one else would. And because I reckon, I needed you as much as you needed me." And Lee's hand found his, tentative at first, then certain. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. In that quiet gesture, James felt something break open inside him, a bond stronger than words, stronger than fear. But peace in the mountains was never eternal. By the end of winter, James saw smoke on the distant ridges, thin trails rising where no hunter should be. He knew the men hadn't given up. They would search, driven by greed and pride, and someday their boots would cross into this hidden valley. When that day came, James would be ready. He would fight if he must, vanish deeper into the wild if he had to, but he would never again allow harm to touch and leer her daughters. For the first time, he had something worth dying for. And more than that, something worth living for. The mountains had taken much from him over the years, carving away at his soul until little remained. But in giving shelter to 3 broken strangers, the mountains had also given him back his purpose. And under the cold, eternal stars, James knew the truth. He was no longer just a lonely mountain man. He was protector, guardian, father, and perhaps one day, more. Whatever storms lay ahead, they would face them together.